You are listening to You Restored with Dr. Kelley Reis. To listen to all episodes, visit libertynaturalwellness.com. On this episode of You Restored, let's get into PCOS, which is polycystic ovarian syndrome. Now, about a month ago, May of 2026, out came a journal article in the Lancet, and that renamed PCOS to PMOS, which is polyendocrine metabolic ovarian syndrome. Now, many of us in the holistic world applauded that move because we have known this for a very long time, that this isn't specifically about the ovaries. I know we focus on the ovaries, but this is specifically not the ovaries. This is a metabolic, an endocrine, a hormonal disruption. So we're all pretty darn happy because the name itself, PCOS, and I'm going to use these names interchangeably because most people know PCOS. Most of you don't even know that it was renamed. So I'll probably use PCOS the most, but this disorder has really, to me, done damage to the women that have been diagnosed with it. And honestly, a lot of women weren't even diagnosed because they didn't fall into the classic symptoms. Now, the classic symptoms for PCOS have been high androgens. Androgens are male hormones, and that would be testosterone and DHEA. A lot of women didn't fall into that, so they weren't diagnosed with PCOS. The idea of polycysts, so P, poly, C, cysts, O, ovarian syndrome. Many women who have gotten ultrasounds don't even have the cysts. So they also weren't diagnosed because you have to have polycysts on your ovaries to be diagnosed with polycystic ovarian syndrome. There has been so much disservice done to women with regards to this disorder. And it's about time that they caught up to actually naming it something better. But those of us in the holistic world, we've known this whole time. So I like to say, duh. It took you long enough to catch up. But standard symptoms. What we used to see was anovulation, so no ovulation, or missed periods. That would be amenorrhea. And missing a period for more than, say, 45 days, moving into 60 days. And if that was longer than that, some women, girls, would go months and months and months, years without having a period. So amenorrhea, anovulation, not ovulating, and that's assessed through ovulation tests and certain blood work and assessments after ovulation would occur. Then we saw acne. Acne was a big one. Women and girls who were diagnosed with PCOS tend to carry a little more weight. That was something that we saw a lot. And also tended to have more hair. So maybe hair on the face, hairier arms, hirsutism. And high androgens, like I said, testosterone and DHEA. Those were the classic PCOS symptoms. And then on ultrasound, they saw multiple cysts in the ovaries. Well, recently, like I said, name change, PMOS. Now we're getting into a little bit better understanding of the cause. You know, I love the cause. So a little better understanding of the cause instead of just looking at these symptoms. So this is something that I see a lot. As I've said numerous times, been in practice 22 years. And testing women and girls all the time, testing their hormones through a Dutch. What I see run through, I do not see high androgens. I would say half of the girls and women that I test have high male hormones. Only half. But what I see running throughout PCOS, or the thought that someone might have PCOS, is estrogen dominance. Estrogen dominance. No one talks about estrogen dominance in PCOS at all. But it is something clinically that I have seen run, I would say 95%, if not higher, of the girls and women that I have tested. So that's a piece to the puzzle, for sure. For sure. And how I see estrogen dominance, 3 ways. It's not always just frank high estrogen, although that is one way. That on a Dutch test, which is the dried urine test for comprehensive hormones, on a Dutch test, it tests for 3 estrogens: estrone, estradiol, estriol. And 1 to 3 of those could be high. So frank estrogen, high estrogen. That is one way to have estrogen dominance. And that may or may not happen. The most common 2 pictures that I see, though, with an estrogen dominance is not in those top 3 estrogens, but it is downstream. So the downstream metabolites are what I see play a bigger factor in the estrogen dominance. That is poor detox of estrogen. You may have absolutely normal estrone, estradiol, and estriol. However, there is a logjam of 1 or 2 of the 3 estrogen metabolites that are very aggravating, very inflammatory. So 4-hydroxyestrone or 16-hydroxyestrone. And this is something that I see a ton more than just frank estrogen dominance, is a poor detox. Now, this is going to cause inflammation, going to cause all sorts of downstream issues. The same as if you would see just high estradiol, for example. So a poor estrogen detox and a logjam high estrogen metabolites. That is the second way that I see estrogen dominance. The third way I see estrogen dominance has nothing to do with estrogen at all. You could have normal estrogen, but a low progesterone. This is a thread that I see a lot in PCOS as well. Low progesterone. Could have absolutely normal estrogen, normal detox of estrogen, but a low progesterone. That is what I call a perceived estrogen dominance, because we need progesterone to counteract estrogen. Progesterone is very calming and very modulating for estrogen, and we need them both in the right amounts so that we get a nice balance of, estrogen does some good things, obviously, and progesterone does. So we need to make sure estrogen doesn't get carried away and grow and do all sorts of things. So that low progesterone piece is a really important piece. But the thread that ties all of my PCOS clients together is estrogen dominance, more than high male hormones. I know it's surprising, but it is absolutely, and that's years of Dutch testing that I've seen that. So it's that unopposed estrogen piece where estrogen gets to do all the naughty stuff that it can do without it being counteracted by progesterone. So what does estrogen dominance do that leads to maybe some of these PCOS symptoms? Well, it aggravates, or the insulin resistance piece. We know that to be a huge factor in PCOS. So we're calling it PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome, but the number 1 prescription in the conventional world for PCOS is metformin. Metformin is meant to attempt to balance blood sugar. So they've known for years and years that insulin is playing a role, and they try to manage it through metformin, which only screws up someone's gut and has all sorts of gastritis side effects. But estrogen, when unopposed, can do a lot of aggravating things. It's very pro-inflammation. And we see that a lot in women and girls with PCOS is they feel inflamed, swollen, breast tenderness a lot of times. And it's driving more of that inflammation when it's unopposed. When it's got its friend progesterone, it doesn't get to do all these things. A lot of fluid retention. So we see a lot of fluid retention. And then mood, for sure. Mood, estrogen dominance, definitely. We see, PMS and all those kind of things when a woman is ovulating and is having a period when there's estrogen dominance. But there's a lot of mood issues with women and girls with PCOS as well. And, when there is a period, it might be light with PCOS, but it could also be infrequent, but then heavy. There is no one picture of PCOS for me when it comes to symptoms. So when we have a low progesterone, that's often due to anovulation. And I mentioned this a few moments ago. Anovulation, not ovulating. If a woman doesn't ovulate, there is no corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum is kind of the eggshell that's left once the egg leaves the follicle. So it's what's left. And that starts to puff up and it releases progesterone. So if there's no ovulation, no trigger for ovulation, then there is no corpus luteum. If there's no corpus luteum, there's no progesterone. And now we have this, if you have no progesterone, periods start by when progesterone goes up and then it comes back down. Normal cycle, after ovulation, the corpus luteum creates progesterone. Progesterone, there's signals back and forth. Was that egg fertilized? No, it wasn't. Okay, progesterone starts to come down. That withdrawal of progesterone causes the period to start. The lining lets go and you have a period. If there's no ovulation, there's no rise in progesterone. There's no rise in progesterone, there can be no fall in progesterone. Then there is no signal to have a menstrual period. So that's why we then see the amenorrhea. So that low progesterone piece is a real clear link too with PCOS. Like I said, back in the day, it was just, you have high male hormones. And I do not see that a lot. Not nearly like it is portrayed. So I want to go back to this estrogen dominance piece because with low progesterone, perceived estrogen dominance, we also have thyroid effects. So PMOS, the new name, polyendocrine metabolic ovarian syndrome. I mean, honestly, the ovaries are thrown in there because sometimes we see cysts. That's why the ovaries are thrown in there. And then obviously we're having period disruptions and things like that. But the metabolic aspect, when there is estrogen dominance, there is likely thyroid dysfunction because estrogen will actively affect or compete with the active thyroid hormone T3. They actually fight for receptors and will interfere. Estrogen will interfere in thyroid T3 receptors. So it throws off the metabolism biochemically, physiologically, when there is estrogen dominance. And this just feeds more into that metabolic dysfunction. This whole thing just feeds more into. So are you starting to see the picture come together that high male hormones may be a factor in some women with PCOS, but it is by no means the main thread for that disorder. And, spironolactone is another common prescription. Let's just lower those male hormones. And I look at labs and say, but you didn't even have high male hormones. Why do they have you on that medication? Well, that's because that medication goes along with that disorder. So it's just prescribed. So getting clear understanding, root cause, guys. You have to understand no two people are alike. We can't just slap a label onto people and think, oh, these are the supplements that go along with this disorder, or these are the meds that go along with this disorder. It's not that simple. Everyone manifests things differently. Absolutely, everyone. Now, there's considered to have 5 types or subtypes of PCOS. The first one, as I mentioned, the androgen driven. That is the high male hormones. And that's easily tested in a Dutch to understand the DHEA and testosterone. Not everybody tests properly in the Dutch in urine for testosterone. On occasion, I will run blood work to see that free and total testosterone if it runs low. Genetically, some people just don't test properly in urine for testosterone. So androgen driven is definitely a big one. Insulin resistance driven. So this is when we really get into metabolic disorders. If you have high insulin, that's one factor that can absolutely play a role there, is seeing a high fasting insulin, but insulin resistance driven. Adrenal driven. Y'all know my love of sympathetic dominance and discussing all of that and the adrenal gland stress response, but adrenal driven. And here's how that works. So high cortisol steals the precursor for progesterone. So it actively steals progesterone away. You end up having perceived estrogen dominance because progesterone is stolen by cortisol. So that's a real active driver for potential PCOS. We have inflammation driven. So these are really wanting to look at the gut microbiome. What is your inflammatory markers looking like? Erythrocyte sedimentation rate. What autoimmune markers do we see elevated? So more of a gut inflammation driving PCOS picture. And then one that is not talked about enough is post-birth control pill, or I would say post-hormonal birth control. Most commonly associated with the oral birth control pill, but it suppresses ovulation. Once again, we go back to suppress ovulation, suppress progesterone. If you suppress progesterone, then we have a perceived estrogen dominance. These are just some subtypes that I see when it comes to PCOS. Now, what do I test to better understand? Well, clearly I use a Dutch test, the dried urine test for comprehensive hormones. It gives me the most comprehensive look at adrenal stress response, estrogen detox, progesterone, progesterone breakdown, male hormones, how those are being distributed when they're metabolized, the whole cortisol side of things, stress response. Is cortisol a factor? It's not always a direct factor. It may look really balanced, but that's because it's stealing from progesterone. I love to look at fasting insulin, inflammatory markers. I like to look at the gut microbiome. Now, do I do this for every single woman that I suspect has PCOS? I do not. It depends. I mean, I talk to these potential clients and decide, what does this woman need to better understand? So those are some ways that I go about looking at PCOS. A lot of people ask me, so how do you treat it? I don't have an answer for that because every woman manifests or presents differently. There is no one size fits all. Might be tired of hearing that. It is the truth. One person may need an absolute sympathetic dominance calming approach. One woman may need an absolute androgen lowering approach. There are definitely different approaches. But one thing I want to say is Beyond the name change, I'm happy they changed polycystic ovarian syndrome to polyendocrine metabolic ovarian syndrome because it gives a little more basis for what's actually happening. They definitely were far behind in it, but at least they caught up. I'm not sure that's going to change how things will probably still prescribe spironolactone and metformin. It may take a long time, or they may never catch up. Let's just be real. They're not going to catch up to holistic doctors like myself. But it's not about the name. It's about the data that we get for you specifically. That is the most important thing. Getting your individualized data instead of just slapping a label, even if it's now a more correct label, without slapping a label on you, figuring out what's happening underneath all of this so that we can fix the broken pathways and help you live the optimal life that you deserve. I'm Dr. Kelley Reis. This is You Restored. Make sure you're doing the real work and getting those real answers.